Okay, why don't we get started? Good morning, everyone. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our third public talk of the full semester on this rainy Friday morning. And this talk is going to feature a presentation by Dr. Charles McDonald that I personally am really looking forward to, and I think you're in for a treat today. I wish we could welcome you all in person on Fifth Avenue, but while this is not yet possible, we've all learned to appreciate some of the advantages of Zoom. And although we're not in the same room, at least this technology allows us to reach out to many more of you, especially if you're outside of New York. And I see that some of you who are here are longtime friends of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, but some of you may be new. So if you would like to receive more information about our activities and upcoming events, please email us so that we can add you to our mailing list. And I'm going to make sure to put all contact information in the chat box momentarily. This event, as you can see, is being recorded. It will be later uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. So I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted during the talk. And after Dr. McDonald's talk, we will have some time for questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to type the word question. If you like to unmute yourself, we will make sure to unmute you in the order that is received in the chat box. If you're unable to unmute yourself, that is perfectly okay, of course, and you can type out your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud for you. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. McDonald, who holds the Sava Savlievich, is that
yes,
the way
well done,
I'm
yes.
supposed to pronounce it? Postdoctoral fellowship in Judeo-Spanish studies at Northwestern University, where he's appointed in Spanish, Jewish studies, and anthropology. Before joining Northwestern, he was a postdoctoral fellow in Jewish studies at Rice University. He received his PhD in anthropology and historical studies at the New School for Social Research, where he also serves as the managing director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. His research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the Posen Foundation, and the Center for Jewish History, among others. His most recent article is Rancor, Sephardi Jews, Spanish Citizenship, and the Politics of Sentiment, and it was published this year in Comparative Studies in Society and History. He is currently finishing his first book, Return to Sfarad, which is an experimental ethnography of the return of Jews and Judaism in contemporary Spain. Today, Dr. McDonald is going to talk about refusing return, Spain's 2015 Sephardic Citizenship law, and the promise of reparations. Cam, the floor is yours.
Francesca, thank you so much for the invitation. I see a few familiar faces and names here, so welcome. I'm going to read for a bit, and then we'll broaden it up to a Q&A. So looking forward to talking more. So the title of my talk today is Refusing Return, Spain's 2015 Sephardic Citizenship Law and the Promise of Reparations. In August of 2016, I received an email from Tony, a Sephardi American expatriate living in Madrid. Have you seen this? Attached was an article recently published in Spain's newspaper of record, El País. Only 2,424 Sephardim have applied for Spanish citizenship, read the article. I'd first met Tony 6 months earlier when I interviewed him about his experience as an applicant under Spain's 2015 Sephardic citizenship law. My light just went out, but can everyone still see me all right? I think so. Okay, great. We'd remained in regular contact as he allowed me to literally and figuratively look over his shoulder while he moved through the application process. His email found me not long after I'd arrived back in New York from a year spent conducting fieldwork and archival research in Spain. Although I'd been making research trips to Spain since 2010, I'd envisioned this most recent visit as the culmination of my dissertation fieldwork, which I had timed to coincide with the law's first year in action. Tony had long been critical of various aspects of the law, including what he considered its overly stringent qualifications, a poorly designed application platform, an unwieldy bureaucratic structure, the application fees and often unavoidable expense of hiring genealogists and lawyers, and the fact that the law itself was temporary rather than permanent. Given that Jewish leaders and government officials had offered estimates for the total number of petitions they might receive, ranging anywhere from 90,000 to more than 500,000, media outlets and Sephardi Jews alike registered surprise at numbers that were considerably lower than expected. The El País article was an early example of a string of media reports over the next few years that suggested that the law was garnering fewer applicants than anticipated due to many of the same issues Tony had identified. In keeping with other media assessments of the law, the article concluded that the typical cost of applying, 3 to 5,000 euros, and that's actually, I think, on the low end, combined with the other requirements that I mentioned above, genealogical documentation, what's called a proof of a special connection with modern Spain, language and culture test, and then finally traveling to Spain to sign the completed application, that all of this would likely dissuade seniors and, of course, people with limited means from applying, which were among the most likely beneficiaries. These bureaucratic and financial obstacles were compounded by poor preparation, inadequate staffing, and an unreliable online submission portal. For all these reasons, the article warned the law risked ending up a fiasco. As the kicker put it, la nostalgia de Sepharad tira mucho, pero no tanto. Nostalgia for Sepharad pulls hard, but not that hard. Other gravities, other claims. In the 2015 law's preamble, as well as in the rhetoric of state and religious authorities, sentiments like nostalgia and love are ascribed to Sephardi descendants, even as the claim that they feel no, quote, rancor, and this is something I discussed in the article that Francesca mentioned, even as the claim that they feel no rancor towards Spain for the expulsion is anxiously repeated. So in this talk, I'm less concerned with how the Spanish state has envisioned the emotions and attachments of its would-be subjects than with the discrepancies between these visions and those expressed by Sephardi descendants themselves. Scholars writing about the Sephardic citizenship laws in Spain and Portugal have rightly argued that we need to attend to the ways that the act of applying for citizenship has often prompted Sephardi descendants to rethink their ancestry, identity, and attachments. But what about those who chose not to apply? How should we read their decisions? Why might it appear preferable or even necessary to refuse the offer of citizenship? What can those perspectives add to our understanding of the ways that people negotiate citizenship and its attendant claims, particularly in scenarios where states promote the offer of citizenship as a form of historical reparation? So this talk is about those Sephardi descendants for whom nostalgia hardly pulled at all, or for whom its pull was insufficient to counteract other forces. This, of course, is not to discount the many Sephardi descendants who welcome these laws for a wide range of reasons, and we can talk about this more after the talk. Nor do I wish to overlook the significant challenges the application process presented for Sephardi descendants. Scholars in a range of fields have pointed out how the law disregards the heterogeneous ways that Sephardi descendants reckon belonging by claiming the nation state as the primary frame for thinking about Sephardic origins and attachments. The law has also elicited strong critiques for exclusion of Muslims and Morisco descendants from similar return legislation schemes. Less frequently addressed has been the question of Sephardi descendants who were eligible and had the means to apply, but chose not to. So I argue that any reckoning with the politics of citizenship as reparation is incomplete without including the experiences of Sephardi descendants who refuse Iberian citizenship. My aim is to consider the conditions of possibility for such decisions and some of the ways that my interlocutors made sense of them. Whether they take the form of explicit rejections, pointed critiques, or general indifference, I read these refusals as political claims. Such claims may also be cautionary, enjoining scholars against inadvertently reproducing the very rhetorics that the Sephardic citizenship laws have summoned and reanimated. A particular concern, I suggest, are invocations of symbolic reparation or reconciliation as done deeds, since these kinds of assertions about the workings of justice failed to resonate with many Sephardi descendants, including the ones that I'll talk about today. So before I continue, I just want to give a short note on sort of the methods and what the fieldwork for this looked like. In the 3 years following Tony's 2016 email and the end of my longest continuous period of fieldwork, I stayed in touch with him and several dozen other interlocutors. These included the diverse and continually shifting members of various Jewish communities in Spain, religious and government authorities, expatriate Jews like Tony who'd been living in Spain for years, Jewish students and tourists, and Sephardi descendants in the diaspora. Since the law was first announced in 2012, I also conducted roughly 40 interviews with Sephardi descendants from Venezuela, Turkey, France, Brazil, Israel, Mexico, Argentina, the UK, and the US. And they ranged in age from their early 20s to their late 70s and included slightly more men than women. Most interviews were conducted primarily over Skype, Zoom, or telephone with some follow-up via WhatsApp or email. So a lot of this actually kind of was a preview of the Zoom era that we're living in now. So while I strive to balance depth and breadth in my fieldwork as a cultural anthropologist, I'm wary of the epistemological claims and the blind spots of qualitative approaches, that purport to capture data according to logics of demographic representation and numerical truth. Nevertheless, this talk is informed by many of these conversations that took place in multiple countries on several digital platforms over a span of years. Most of these interviews were conducted online and a few took place in person. So the talk draws on those relationships and the conversations, as well as the broader ethnographic and archival research of my larger book project on the return to Sepharad. So this story is just one small part of what I think is that larger story of return, or in this case, the refusal of return. Here I focus only on 3 exchanges, which I think help reveal the underexplored theme of refusal among Sephardi descendants. I do not, nor could I hope to, speak to the full spectrum of reasons why people did not apply to the Spanish law, which is an option that's no longer available, or those who have not yet applied to the Portuguese law, which is still open and receiving applications. Sephardi descendants understood the law, its promise of return, and their relations to it, of course, in many different ways. To the extent that ethnography is imagined as authorized by its grounding in the empirical, it's the particularity rather than the generalizability of these scenes that I'm interested in. This is what anthropologist Marilyn Strathern has called, quote, partial knowledge, motivated, fragmentary, and in pursuit of good connections. So I think with the words of these 3 interlocutors, not to claim them as representative cases, but rather to track some of the flashpoints where unsettled histories, personal experience, and collective imaginings collide to animate a politics of refusal. Disappointment, frustration, critique. In retrospect, I think of Tony's decision to forward me the El País article in August 2016 as marking the beginning of a shift in the way that many of my interlocutors spoke about the law. Between 2012, when proposals for the law were first introduced, and late 2015, when the law went into effect, most people I spoke to were excited and hopeful about the citizenship legislation. Of course, they had questions and concerns. There was a widespread sense that the new Spanish law represented an important commitment, albeit largely symbolic, to redressing the injuries of the past and perhaps even securing a better future. Even Tony, who was as realist as they come and had exhaustively discussed what he perceived as the law's limitations, was nevertheless eager for the law to go into effect. Indeed, he was one of the very first to apply. But as more people experienced the lengthy and frustrating application process themselves, and critical reports about the low numbers and the obstacles began to circulate in the press, in conversations, on blogs, the mood noticeably darkened. To some degree, this isn't surprising at all. Many of the people I was speaking to were now being confronted, either personally or in mediated accounts, by a reality that did not live up to the hopes and fantasies they had nurtured when the law existed solely as a promise. Words that I'd rarely heard uttered before late 2016 began to litter the pages of my field notes and my audio transcripts. Interlocutors increasingly spoke of the law as superficial, disorganized, slapdash, and insincere. One person I interviewed in 2017 was convinced that Spain had quote, passed the law to make themselves feel good, but there was no infrastructure behind it or anything like that, end quote. Like a number of other Sephardi descendants I spoke to, he chose to apply to Portugal instead of Spain, based on what he read in the news and heard from friends and family who were familiar with the process. Just a reminder, if you could mute your microphones, thanks. So this process, which he deemed disorganized. One successful applicant who in 2019 referred to the law as superficial told me he felt it was deliberately limited. He speculated that this was because the government was, quote, afraid of all this anti-Jewish public in Spain. I noted this shift in language both among those I had spoken to previously and with first-time interviewees, where negative evaluations became more common over time. I am, of course, not suggesting that everyone soured on the law or that my interlocutors either felt solely one way or the other. More often than not, they had quite mixed feelings. My point is that if earlier narratives were largely positive, if tempered by specific critiques, the frequency and volume of negative descriptions increased as my interlocutors had more first and second-hand knowledge about the practicalities of applying and emerging statistics about how many of those applications were being submitted and approved. So it's against this backdrop that I interpret the refusals I described, even as I understand them less as a direct response to low numbers than as a widening discrepancy between what my interlocutors felt had been promised and what was being delivered. As we'll see, some of them believe the law could and should reunite an orphaned diasporic people with their culture and place of origin. Others hoped the law might help save vulnerable Sephardi Jews from anti-Semitism and political turmoil in places like Venezuela and Turkey, or the US and the UK, by giving them refuge in Spain. Still others insisted that the law should establish a permanent legal right to Spanish citizenship for Sephardi Jews, along with a comprehensive set of legal, cultural, and educational measures that would ensure they would be safe and respected in Spain. Part 1, Refusing Absolution. Alexandra was a middle-aged Sephardic American woman with piercing blue-gray eyes and an intense energy that was both commanding and charming. We met in September of 2016 at a New York bakery known for its excellent babka, which some of you may be familiar with. Wedging ourselves into two sides of a tiny white table, we made small talk as I retrieved my notebook and recorder and prepared to begin interviewing her about what I understood as her plans to apply for the Spanish law. I was thrown off when it said she began grilling me. Why was Spain doing this? Why was it limited to a 3-year window? How were they determining who counted as Sephardic? And perhaps most importantly, would she be absolving Spain of its past by applying? So if the first 3 questions were ones I had been grappling with for some time, the last one surprised me, because it centered not on what the abstract entity of Spain wanted, but on what Sephardi Jews in the diaspora might not want. Until that point, it hadn't occurred to me that anyone who could take advantage of the law might choose not to. I had taken for granted that it was the ethical position of the state that was most pressing. But she brought a more expansive notion of ethics into view, one that was rooted in the agency of potential Spanish subjects and that presupposed an already present obligation on the part of the Spanish state towards Sephardi descendants. It wasn't until we were quite far along in the discussion that I learned Alexandra was an attorney who'd spent decades working with immigrants and refugees, and so was especially attuned to the double-edged sword of citizenship, its capacity to simultaneously include and exclude. She told me she was concerned about the unwarranted legitimacy that her application might confer on a law that she and other Jews considered inadequate on moral and historical grounds. Although she'd agreed to me because she was thinking about applying for the law, by the end of the conversation, she seemed certain that she'd be doing no such thing. I had just returned from a year of fieldwork and was only beginning to review my notes, so I had fewer answers to her questions than we both would have liked. But looking back on our conversation, it strikes me that my responses hardly mattered. It's not that she was delivering a prepared monologue, as I had come to expect from some interviewees, which is sort of part and parcel of fieldwork, or that she'd arrived with, a fixed set of convictions. Instead, I think she was reflecting in real time as she cycled through questions, felt their implications, and then arrived somewhere new. She seemed disappointed or perhaps indignant, as if she had retroactively been betrayed and was already anticipating a betrayal that had not yet fully materialized. She was reasoning, it seemed to me, through sentiments. Theoretical approaches associated with the so-called affective turn have largely failed to address the discrepancies between the sentiments and attachments sanctioned by states in the name of citizenship and those that subjects or would-be subjects actually experience. Alexandra's investments are opaque from the perspective of theories that draw arbitrary distinctions between affect and emotion, and between either of these and reason. Given the ways in which affect theory has reproduced mind-body dualisms, it may be more helpful to think with sentiments, which anthropologist Ann Stoler has defined as, quote, judgments, assessments, and interpretations of the social and political world. To speak of sentiments, then, is to recognize that Alexandra's emotive and ethical deliberations are already part of the same history as the Spanish state's appeals to nostalgia, and thus ought to be brought into the same analytic frame. Not only did Alexandra maintain that applying would be tantamount to absolving Spain of its historical responsibility to Sephardi Jews, she told me that she had also been dissuaded by the fact that Spain had not made the long-term investments in education, infrastructure, and social welfare that would be necessary to combat anti-Semitism and make the settlement of new Jewish citizens viable. Her sense of the poverty of the law and its lack of institutional support emerged in part from her work with an NGO that worked on issues of historical memory and human rights. For her, post-Holocaust Germany offered a model for atonement, reconciliation, and material support that Spain could have followed if it had been serious about the return of Jews. This was a position taken by a number of other people I spoke with. Since nothing in the spirit or the letter of Spain's now expired law resembles a, quote, right of return, as established in other contexts, the citizenship it offers is better understood as a gift, one which attempts to foreclose rather than address the question of reparations. As anthropologist Marcel Mauss has shown, gifts incur obligations. They do not just reflect relationships, they also create and sustain them. While Mauss understood the refusal of a gift as ending relations, anthropologist Carol McGranahan has asked us to consider refusal as, quote, a generative act, a rearrangement of relations rather than an ending of them. In the case she describes, exiled Tibetans have preemptively refused citizenship in India and Nepal for decades on the grounds that it might void their claims on Tibet. Her account is in conversation with another anthropologist, Audra Simpson, who's theorized how indigenous people participate in, quote, calculated refusals of the gifts of the state and in vexed determinations of membership and belonging in that state. This is a different sort of refusal than we're used to thinking about, one that decenters the state as the only grounds for thinking the political and inquires instead into how it's productive for those who refuse. While the relationship of Sephardi descendants to the citizenship offered by Spain and Portugal and the political stakes of their refusal is distinct from Tibetan refugees or indigenous Iroquois, there are important resonances. Any state's power to grant citizenship is founded on inequality. This is perhaps especially clear when citizenship takes the form of a gift bestowed, rather than a right demanded and enforced. Refusal recasts that relationship of inequality in favor of a political otherwise. As McGranahan writes, refusal involves attachments, connections to a goal, relations to ambitions. It is a no committed to generating a yes. I think that last part is actually really important. Alexandra evidently did not feel the nostalgia for Spain that state discourses suggested she would or should. The affective states I discerned in our conversation had less to do with Spain's history and more to do with its present failure to acknowledge that history. Her indignation arose in response to what she and so many other Sephardi descendants saw as Spain's superficial treatment of historical justice and the reparative work required to enact it. Suspicious of what the acceptance of Spanish citizenship entailed, she refused to even apply. If Alexandra was being pulled at all, it was not by nostalgia for Sepharad, but by her attachments to other Jews and by her awareness of the ways that citizenship so often denies rather than confers rights. The pull of these ethical demands envisioned a more honest, comprehensive, and lasting reparative politics for Sephardi descendants, one that might be possible someday, but not under the conditions of the 2015 law. Indifference. In early 2019, Aaron responded to a request for interviews I posted in a Facebook group for Venezuelan Jews. A few weeks later, we spoke on the phone as his son was driving him to an appointment in the Midwestern US city where they lived. Born in 1974, Aaron was, like many Venezuelan Jews his age, the child of Sephardic immigrants who had left Morocco shortly after independence from France and Spain in 1956. When I asked him what he thought about the Spanish citizenship law, he told me there was a, quote, ethical component, given the history of the Inquisition, and that the law would be a way for Spain to address what he termed their, quote, very hard history with the Jews. Although he thought it was helpful for Spain to recognize both this history and other diasporic Sephardi Jews like himself, Arona suspected that there were ulterior motives at play. In the years since the law was first announced, he'd come to believe that, quote, it was a strategy to control the demographics. Certain people have been growing. Some areas have grown heavily in terms of the Muslim population, end quote. I gathered from his tone that such a concern on the part of the Spanish state was not unreasonable or surprising to him, but rather obvious, perhaps even unimportant. Aron said that many Venezuelans he knew had applied for the law over the past 4 years, hoping that a Spanish passport might offer them an escape for the rather grim situation at home. As for him, he already held dual US citizenship and had been living in the States for the past decade, so he saw no reason to apply. Aron identified strongly with his Moroccan Sephardi ancestry and with his home of Venezuela. Like Alexandra, he did not, quote, need Spanish citizenship, nor feel particularly attached to Spain, though he believed that Spain owed something to Sephardi descendants. Unlike her, however, the law failed to generate any strong emotional response in him, indignant or otherwise. As he told me simply, I don't have big emotions about it. Aron's emotional indifference towards Spain and the Sephardic citizenship law echoed a conversation I'd had 2 years earlier with Casey, an American in his mid-30s living in New York. When we spoke, he highlighted his relative privilege as an American, even at a time when anti-Semitism in the US had risen dramatically since Trump's 2016 election. As he observed, quote, of all the people who deserve reparations of any kind from a state that has an opportunity to give those reparations, I guess we're low on the list. It's not like we're refugees. It's not a pressing concern, at least not here. While having a Spanish passport and the mobility that it conferred was not a pressing concern in New York, it was in Venezuela, where much of Casey's family still lived. Quote, they're kind of screwed. All their property and assets are in Venezuela, but they want to leave really badly. And yet, as he explained, his Venezuelan family members were unlikely to avail themselves of either the Spanish or Portuguese citizenship offers. While his family deeply identified as Sephardi Jews, he explained that theirs was, quote, not a deep-seated connection to Spain. Their attachments lay elsewhere. As he said, quote, especially because my Venezuelan family are Jews now, they're not crypto Jews. If they needed to get out, I think they'd say either America or Israel. Spain would be pretty low on their list. When I asked why Spain was such an improbable choice for them, he explained that Israel or America would be easier transitions, since his family had networks in both countries. But their disinterest in Spain or Portugal was not only a matter of familiarity and convenience. Quote, from an emotional standpoint even, I think they would want to be in Israel versus Spain or Portugal, If it were more of a refugee issue, it would be those places versus the desire to have a passport. But why those places? I asked. Casey explained that there were more Jews in the US and Israel, right? But beyond that, his family, quote, identified with a global Jewish culture more than they identify with a more provincial Sephardi or Spanish culture, end quote. I asked Casey whether his parents, who lived in the US and were eligible for both of the Iberian citizenship laws, would consider applying. With a half smile, he shook his head no. His father and grandmother were still Dutch citizens. They weren't, quote, concerned or interested in the Iberian legislation because they felt, as he put it, no need to reconcile. As the language of the law suggested, they might. For Casey's parents and grandparents, there was no inevitable or even predictable correspondence between Sephardi ancestry and national attachments. Rather, emotional connections are the result of pre-existing relationships and modes of reckoning with history and solidarity. For them, Spain and Portugal are abstract and, according to him, provincial places. Whatever pull they may have had for earlier generations of Sephardi Jews is eclipsed by the lively social and economic ties his family has with Israel and the US. The older generations in his family simply don't consider Spain or Portugal as important nodes in what he called a global Jewish culture. They harbored neither nostalgia nor rancor for Spain, nor any other sentiments, it seemed. Despite his American family's anxieties about Trump and his Venezuelan family's increasingly desperate situation, they chose not to apply to either of the Iberian citizenship laws. Their refusal took the form of indifference. And then I'll just conclude briefly. So in this talk, I've considered how some Sephardi descendants respond to the gift of citizenship, the quandaries it occasions, and the opportunities it may provide for thinking and doing politics otherwise. In different ways, these brief ethnographic vignettes foreground discrepancy as a galvanizing force for sentiments and actions. The stories unfolded by Alexandra, Aaron, and Casey echo something I found in my other fieldwork as well. Spain's Sephardic citizenship law has a way of disturbing the very histories of exile and diaspora that it claims to ameliorate or even supersede. Ironically, by casting Sephardi descendants as essentially Spanish, in a fantasy of national integration and redemption, the central narrative that the law seeks to enact ends up undermining itself. Like any mechanism for granting citizenship, Spain's law aims to identify and secure the right kinds of national subjects, whether through the explicit criteria for inclusion that determine who counts as a Sephardi Jew or Sephardi descendant, the tacit exclusion of Muslim and Morisco descendants, or the obstacles inadvertently created for applicants for being charitable. So the plural Sephardi histories I encountered in my fieldwork were entangled in multiple diasporas and empires, entanglements that were obscured by the neat lists of nations where Sephardi descendants were or were not applying. For many of my interlocutors, the law articulated a normative correspondence between sentiment and attachment that bore little resemblance to their lives. The discrepancy between their conceptions of Sephardi history, identity, and reparative justice and those embedded in the law triggered a profound misrecognition. Individual feelings of misrecognition existed alongside, and sometimes in tension with, other more positive sentiments. For some of the Sephardi descendants I came to know, the law's failure to correspond with what they knew and how they felt prompted them to reassess how they might relate to Spain and to citizenship itself. For more than a century, philo-Sephardic thinkers have promoted the return of Sephardi Jews as the solution to many of Spain's problems, even as they fretted about the possibility that Jews continued to harbor rancor for the expulsion because they refused to let go of the past. But the refusal enacted by the Sephardi descendants I've described here was not born of an irrational emotional attachment to the injuries of the past, but of the inequities of the present. Rather than breaking with the past to reconcile and repair, the law appeared to some of my interlocutors as a continuity. They refused the gift of citizenship not as a rebuke of Spain's history, but of its unilateral transformation of that history such that what many of them saw as an inadequate or even cynical gesture of atonement could be presented as a resolution. By attending to Sephardi refusals, I think we're better able to take stock of a more complicated geography of belonging and ethical relations than that envisioned by Spain's law. Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to discussing.
Thank you so much, Cam, for this really fascinating presentation. I'm gonna actually open with a question, and we do have plenty of time for questions. So feel free to either type the word question in the chat if you want to unmute yourself, or if you cannot unmute yourself, you can type out your question and I'll read it for you. But the question I had has to do with putting the field work that you've delineated for us today in dialogue with the field work that you did in Spain. And I'm very curious to hear if, while you were in Spain, the potential negative reaction of Spaniards that you talked, non-Jewish Spaniards that you talked to, may add another facet to your three refuseniks reasoning for deciding not to apply. You do allude to the fact that the people that refuse to apply are aware of some anti-Semitic underlying sentiment in Spain. So I'm just curious about that balance. What did you find out while you were living in Spain and talking with Spaniards about the law of return and their potentially negative view of it, or maybe positive view of it, and how that translated abroad in the consciousness of people that were grappling with the decision and ultimately decided not to apply?
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's actually a really important connection to make. So the bulk of my field work was split between Madrid and Barcelona, sort of let's say the official period of field work in 2015 and 2016, but I've been in Spain regularly since 2005. But this project started coming together around 2010. And this was before this law was announced as a possibility. So in the earliest form, this project was about what many people were calling a Jewish revival in Spain, or a return, that included not just the growth of new synagogues and communities, but also Spaniards who found or believed they had Sephardic ancestry actually converting or returning to Judaism. So a lot of my fieldwork took place in synagogues, in Jewish associations and groups, and lots of events, including protests around anti-Semitic incidents in the press, for example. And so one of the things that I found is that the Jewish community in Spain, which is quite small, it's around 50,000 people, a lot of people weren't particularly interested in the law. They sort of felt neutral about it. They thought that maybe it was symbolically something good or interesting. But I was sort of surprised to find that they're just, except for people who were directly involved in it, the larger Jewish community just kind of seemed indifferent. And as for non-Jewish Spaniards, I would say most people were also not really aware of the law unless they were extremely active in politics. And so one of the things that I track in my most recent article, Ranker, is a debate that took place in Congress when the law was, or several debates really that took place in Congress when the law was being modified and approved, around precisely who gets included and who doesn't. And some of that language also, of course, referred to both the reality of anti-Semitic sentiment in Spain, and also I think the various ways that people imagine that, and of course the debate over what constitutes anti-Semitism, et cetera. So I think that the folks that I spoke to in the diaspora were aware of this, although I guess the cautionary note I would make is that And one of the things that in my work I'm trying really hard to unsettle is this idea of Spain as sort of foundationally or forever anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic, right? Spain is figured as sort of, it's Spain equals the Inquisition equals anti-Jewish hatred. I think the larger problem, or a better way to figure it, is that there's a profound disconnect in sort of larger Spanish, I don't know, society. There's a lack of knowledge, profound knowledge and understanding, right? And Jews are imagined as like historical figures, or conflated with Israel, right? So these are things we've seen in many other places. So I think that's some of the context in which those that I spoke to who refused were thinking about: is this a place I would want to be? Is this a place I could make a home? And is this a gift? That's my word, not theirs. But is this gift sincere in a sense?
Yeah, I see a note from Elizabeth Kincaid in the chat, who's saying the most poignant response I've personally heard is, why do they want to know where we are now? I'm not sure, Elizabeth, if you had a question following up, or if Cam, you want to address that comment.
Yeah, I don't know if Elizabeth, if you want to elaborate on that at all. If not, I can speak to that.
Thank you so much. Not so
Yeah.
much. It was just an observation. I was having a conversation, and to me, I was super excited. Like, oh my gosh, there's like this recognition, an acknowledgement, and then to hear it was actually a friend's sister who said to him, "Why do they care now? Why do they want to know where we are?" Which I think shifted my personal perspective on the conversation, and made me, I guess, a little more suspicious and watchful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that, Elizabeth. I think one way to frame this, and I alluded to this earlier in the talk, is that the moment when the law was introduced in 2015, so that period from 2015 to 2016 was also a moment, as I think many of us know perhaps all too well, of a real global resurgence of populist movements, and particularly right-wing populist movements, anti-Semitic movements, conspiracy theories. So on the one hand, the rise of populism was part of why Sephardi Jews and Sephardi descendants, who no longer identify as Jewish, were eager about this law and interested, because this offered a literal lifeline for many of them. And this is particularly true in Venezuela. And then on the other hand, I think this climate of fake news, etc., I think fed into a kind of skepticism that sometimes found a way to kind of reconnect with a little bit of conspiracy theory, right? And I think the truth is less exciting in some ways, right? This law came about through a convergence of a lot of different people with different motivations and different stakes. There were folks in the Jewish community, particularly in Madrid, who were involved in making this law, who had first proposed it. In fact, very much for the purpose of offering some kind of refuge for Sephardi communities in Turkey and Venezuela. But at the same time, that kind of combines with a very long history, as I argue in my book manuscript, of the Spanish state having an investment in Sephardi Jews as as figures, not as real people, right? But as objects that in service of the Spanish nation or Spanish Empire. And there's this long-held belief that if the Jews return to Spain, that this could improve Spain's lot in the world. And so one of the things that I argue is this law, in some ways, is a continuation of that logic. But it's not only that; it also represents, I think, Jews with real investments. The last thing I would say, though, is that the law, when it was being drafted, the folks involved in Spain did not, as they told me quite explicitly, did not consult Sephardi communities in the places they were supposedly, targeting for help. So I think that tells you about the sort of the slipperiness of a project like this, and the different people that are involved and what their, often opposing attachments are.
Do we have a comment by David Mendoza? David.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm a Sephardic Jew. I belong to a Sephardic community in London, and I'm also a Sephardic genealogist. And I was really interested by what you have to say, but it doesn't exactly sit with the experience. I think of our community, that, for example, when we first heard about this law, we met it with sort of bewildered amusement. I mean, Spain is somewhere sort of cheap. We go on holiday from Britain, and there is no relationship with Spain. I mean, I've done my research and I've got my family back to the Inquisition and so forth, but as a community, our historic relationship is with Amsterdam, not even with Portugal, and I think I was interested by what you were just saying about the motives for making the law, because the people who drafted the law have no understanding of Sephardic history or genealogy, and perhaps indeed what I end up feeling, and I should say I've actually acquired Portuguese citizenship myself now, but that's more about not queuing at airports rather than any sort of great nostalgia, but. I think what we have really, though, from here is unintended consequences. That the Sephardic community just seems to be caught in other people's fantasy world. It's like, how the Spanish imagine us to be. I think the King of Spain said we were yearning to return to Spain, or some such nonsense.
Yeah.
And we now also have this whole identitarian movement in the United States, sort of B'nai Anasim crypto Jews who may or may not have some Jewish ancestry somewhere. And I hope perhaps that's something that as you advance your studies, you can look at. I'm not really sure of this question there, but it's just my experience.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that you highlighted is really important, and some of which came up in the talk today, but it's certainly part of the larger book project, which is absolutely where do people imagine their connections to lie, right? So, for example, there's a large Sephardi community here in the States, in Seattle, right? But they are connected to the history of the former Ottoman Empire. So for many of them, it's not Spain that exists as if there's nostalgia, or if there's curiosity or some other kind of attachment, right? It's not Spain, it's the former Ottoman Empire, it's Turkey, it's it's Ladino, right? And I saw that in many different ways, with both how, as you said, right, how states have their sort of their own projects that they've enlisted Sephardi Jews as kind of figures, right, as almost literary figures in, and then actual Jews themselves, both in Spain, in the case of my research, and also in the diaspora, and it ranged. I mean, I guess part of the reason I wanted to focus in this talk on refusal, and that I think it's important, is so much of both the writing in news media and recent scholarship about this is really focused on sort of the positive aspects, I guess, or the longing that many people say they do feel, right? Or the celebration that the law was met with. And I think it's important to balance that a bit with, anything ranging from what you called, right, bewildered amusement to outright hostility or rejection. But there's a much wider range of sentiments that people feel about the law, but also the way that sentiment actually, ideas about how people feel or should feel, is itself part of the history of the law, and part of the way that it's unfolding people are responding to it. So thank you again.
We have some more time for questions. Are there any other questions or comments from people in the audience?
Yes.
I see. Yes, Professor Bahlul.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I have a question for Cam, whom I've known for a few years, and whose work I know a little bit, perhaps not entirely. But Cam, I'd like to ask you a question, and forgive me if you have addressed that issue in your work, about the theory of reparation. You know, reparation is a concept that is now spreading along a number of countries of the West, particularly former colonial powers. And I'm thinking about France because I'm from there. But, you know, I'd like to hear what you think about this very concept. I do think that anthropologists have to say something about the very concept of reparation and how it has been put into legal application or political application in a variety of countries of the West, particularly. So, in any case, you know, there is a major aspect of reparation in the return to Sepharad. But, you know, for example, I'll give you an example that happened really in the past few days. President Macron of France decided a few years ago, when he was a candidate, he said that colonialism was a crime against humanity. And in his program, he had the project of returning artifacts to previously colonized countries. And so he did. Just a few days ago, a number of pieces of art of Benin were returned. You know, it created an incredible enthusiasm among these countries that got their cultural patrimony back. So in any case, so that's one aspect. And of course, you know, needless to tell you that this has created a big controversy in France, especially among the right-wing parties. So in any case, I think that you have something to say about this very concept of reparation and how it is applied or how it is evolving in the Spanish context, but also as compared to the German concept and the Polish situation. If you think about, you know, the reparations to Jews only, okay? So anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joël, a treasured colleague. So glad you could be here with us today. Yeah, reparations is really central, or the logic of what counts as repair, what counts as reparative, and what is the thing that is being repaired, right? So there's a lot at play when this idea of reparations is invoked. And as you rightly noted, right, that we see this more and more being incorporated in the legal realm as sort of legal fixes, and oftentimes it takes the form of material objects or money in some cases, right, or land, and of course citizenship is one of those things. And you know what's so the tricky thing is, right, that these are all very different contexts, right? So the question of reparations for the descendants of enslaved people in the United States versus the question of reparations in the history of, let's say, French colonialism, right? Each of these carries a very different histories of empire, of colonization, of racialization and power. But the kind of central concern with all of them is what counts as a repair. And so, and again, what is the injury that we're highlighting? So I get into this a bit in my most recent article and more in the book. the Spanish state, officially in its documents, in this law, in various speeches from the king and others, the injury, of course, it's the expulsion, right, that is announced or identified as the historical injury. And I think most people could agree on that. But where there tends to be disagreement is precisely on like what the temporality is. If Sephardi descendants do not feel the love or affection or nostalgia that they are presumed to feel, there's embedded in this almost a critique. But that's precisely the issue for so many people I talked with. The injury is less about something that happened 500 years ago. The injury for them is actually now, and how insufficient the law is, and what they called, again, insincere, transparent, not fully formed. And so I think it's actually sometimes these issues that are cast as sort of settled in the past, they're actually they're questions of the very politics of right now. And I think we'll continue to see a lot of debate and anger about this law, particularly since it expired. And as some of you may know, the Portuguese law is still active. And I think we've seen this even more recently, the other side of what I've been talking about in this talk, which is, some of you may have seen over the summer, a big article came out in the New York Times, which was followed up by pieces in El País and elsewhere, about many thousands of applications that were quite suddenly seemed to be rejected in Spain, many of which were caught in the backlog during COVID. And there was a big outcry, and the American Sephardi Federation has had several conferences about this and meetings. Some of the associations in New Mexico who feel that Latinx Sephardi descendants there, of which there are many in the U.S. Southwest, have been unfairly targeted. And I wrote down earlier one little quote that I just want to share very quickly. I can find it. So a congressional representative for New Mexico, Teresa Leger Fernandez, said, quote, "Their refusal," and she's talking about the Spanish state in this case, not applicants, "their refusal is worse than if they didn't offer citizenship in the first place. This is an example of how you don't do reparations," right? So this is the other side of it, is that people who do feel that are they entitled to and want a politics of reparation, and see their rejection by the state as sort of compounding the injury. So I know that doesn't address everything you've raised, but Joel, I 100% agree with you. I think anthropology in particular has a lot to offer in thinking through what counts as reparations, how that's related to law, what are the limits of law as a domain for enacting reparations, and how people are navigating that in their everyday lives.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And I'm just gonna draw your attention to some links in the chat. One to a New York Times article about restitutions to Benin, Nigeria, of the stolen bronzes, and the other one, it's a piece on the Spanish nationality law in the Times of Israel by David Mendoza. Cam, to follow up on this question, can you tell us a little more about the framing of the law? What is the legal underpinning that leads to the offer that was made to descendants of Sephardic Jews, for those of us that may not be entirely familiar with the legal framework here?
Sure. So the law is largely based on, just at a very technical level, on a royal decree that was instituted in 1924, which was in part in response about the dissolution of the protege system that existed, where European states and empires had protected groups in various zones. And so this law theoretically was about protecting Spanish proteges. But in reality, almost the only people that actually who were what's the word I'm looking for? The only people who actually qualified under this were Sephardi Jews, particularly in Morocco and Turkey. And that law also included had sort of some of the same kinds of limitations that this one does, right? What I call criteria for inclusion. So the 2015 law is based on that, but what existed prior to the 2015 law was a sort of case-by-case system where individual people could apply, and there is a specific eligibility for Sephardi people, but they're approved on a case-by-case basis rather than a larger kind of framework that would collectively evaluate applications. So in some ways, some people have argued there was no need for this law, that it appeared to be solving a problem that didn't exist, because in the end, it didn't actually offer any additional rights. It did do a couple things in that previously, if one wanted to gain Spanish citizenship through this measure, you had to renounce your other citizenship. So obviously that's a big, important difference. And it did create this system for evaluating them that was in part run by the Federation of Jewish Communities of Spain and in part by the government, depending on how you submitted your application. So there's this sort of technical history of the law. And then I would say there's the sort of conceptual or discursive history of it, which I'm very interested in, which is, I think, even in the language that the law uses, is so bound up in ideas of claiming Sephardi Jews as essentially Spanish, right? And very much invested in ideas about blood and language and an almost deterministic idea of belonging. And so that some of my skepticism and critique of the law has to do with the ways that it reproduces a kind of racialization of Jews and Sephardi Jews, and a way in which in the form of a gift, I argue the state is actually making a claim on Jews. And I think it's something that, it's not unique to Spain, but it's something that we need to think about when we appraise the value of laws that claim to be doing reparative work or justice-oriented work or making good on the past, is for whom and how, and what are the logics that underpin this legislation like this.
We still have a few minutes before we are going to end this call. Any final questions or comments?
I have one, Francesca. My name is
Please,
Rivka, and I'm sorry I came late and I explained why. But Charles, I hear you about speaking something about Venezuela Jews, and I came late. So if we have time, could you tell me in one line or 1 minute what was about that? Sorry, thank you.
Sure. So what I mentioned is that so in the origins of the current law, one important factor that the Jewish community in Spain, and particularly in Madrid, was very much thinking that a law like this would be useful for Sephardi Jews in places like Venezuela and Turkey specifically, that Spain could offer some sort of refuge. And then, the other part, of course, is that as things have deteriorated in Venezuela, there have been many, applications, obviously, from there, and many people have spent lots of money trying to assemble those. So there's kind of two forces at work. There are many Venezuelan Sephardi people, or even people who didn't know that they had Sephardi ancestry, right, that now see an opportunity to perhaps make a life in Spain or somewhere else in the EU. And there are also people, as I mentioned in this talk, one of the people I spoke with, Aaron, who, in his case, he's a U.S. citizen. He lives here, but who's very skeptical of the law. And of course, this varies widely, right, on the various kinds of class and economic privileges one might have, where you have citizenship, etc. But I think that the Spanish law is interesting, and ones like it in Portugal and Germany, even, that one of the things that these like return laws, and I put heavy quotations around that they offer a really interesting window into the geopolitics of citizenship. Who needs citizenship? Who can say no comfortably? Who feels like they can make demands or express critique, right? And I think it's very much tied up in the shifting dynamics around anti-Semitism, race, global populist movements, etc. A second project that I'm working on is precisely about how Jewish citizenship laws offer a way into seeing what's going on in the politics of citizenship around the world, because they often are activating things and movements and people's sensibilities in unexpected ways.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I hear that also many Venezuelans trying to escape from all of this political situation with Maduro and Chavez. And it's very interesting that many of them realize that they are descendants of crypto Jew. So it was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, Joy, go ahead.
Yeah, I know that Joel raised this, and as I was listening to you, I was thinking as well. I just wonder if there have been any comparative studies of such interest in getting Spanish citizenship and or Portuguese with Germany and Poland. I mean, each country has their own particular situation, and Spain, of course, was much further back in time. But I, like David, I'm a genealogist as well, and I've been approached by people, particularly from with roots in Poland and Spain, who are interested in getting, in an EU passport. But the whole interest in what you say about identity and citizenship is, a comparative study would be really interesting, because of the, those three countries are in the EU.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joy. So I'm actually, this talk comes out of a chapter that's in an edited volume that hopefully will be coming out sometime, maybe toward the end of next year, edited by Irina Ben-Mayor and Dalia Candioti. And that is interdisciplinary. It's scholars from a range of backgrounds. And that's a comparative study of the Portuguese and Spanish laws. As far as something broader, which would include Poland, Germany, etc. As far as I know, there's not something like that, but that is part of the project I'm hoping to do, is to put together at least an edited journal volume, and perhaps a larger book, because I think that comparative work is really useful and necessary right now. So yes, I hope that comes to fruition.
Yeah, have you heard of the book called A Place They Called Home, Reclaiming Citizenship, Stories of a New Jewish Return to Germany? Have you heard of that book?
No, I haven't.
The editor spoke at the Center for Jewish History a couple of years ago. It's rather interesting because it's essays by different, I think, Americans who why they decided to apply for German citizenship.
Yeah, and this is something I talk about a bit in the book manuscript as well, is that, right, it's not just in places like Venezuela and Turkey. Many people in the US and the UK were excited about this, particularly around Brexit and during the Trump years. There was a massive, I think applications from the UK for the Portuguese law at one point rose by like 80%, right, after the first Brexit vote. And in the U.S. as well, right? There was a lot of concern about what would the Trump years mean for Jews, and would people need a plan B, right? So these kinds of laws end up being potential avenues for people to actually move or to gain citizenship or to reassess how they feel in the place that they're living in ways that are often totally unanticipated, right? That people leaving gaining Portuguese citizenship to be able to maintain mobility in the EU isn't necessarily what how either of those laws was envisioned. And of course, same with folks in the Southwest who were concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Latinx sentiment in the U.S. So there's all kinds of interesting, I think, ways that these kinds of return legislation packages end up configuring themselves.
I see that there are no other questions, so we can come to a close. Thank you so much, Cam. I said at the beginning that you'd be in for a treat, and I think you really did not disappoint. This was such a rich conversation, and thank you for your presentation, for a sort of sneak peek into your forthcoming book. We're really grateful for this. And I also want to thank you all for coming this morning. I see that some of you have joined late because of the time difference. We are in New York, so it is Eastern Standard Time, but the good news is that the event is being recorded and it will be later uploaded to the YouTube channel of the center. So please be in touch if you'd like to receive a recording. And again, thank you all. Thank you, Cam, for such an exciting talk. Have a great Friday. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend.